Studies Section 12, The Rejection of Metaphysics. Introduction. David Hume, the 18th century British empiricist, is standardly described as the one who took the orientation of empiricism to its logical conclusion. One of the central ideas of David Hume is his rejection of metaphysics through his thesis concerning the nature of notions such as causation or causality, God, religion, and morality, as well as history or historical statements. Therefore, David Hume's contribution to the discourse of metaphysics can best be understood in his treatment of metaphysics as sophistry and illusory. Central concepts such as causality, he argued, cannot be conclusively explained in any reasonable sense. For him, there are two aspects of empiricism that can assist us in assessing reality. One of such consists in ideas and the other impressions. Whatever is not the object of either of these two could not be a reality. For whatever is given to us through impression, that is, direct contact with the external world, is knowable. In the same vein, whatever is given to us through ideas that are backed up by impressions are knowable. In this study session, you will learn about the central argument in Hume's discourse with particular reference to his rejection of metaphysics. You will also evaluate the place of metaphysics and metaphysical notions along with religious experiences and moral judgments in everyday life experience. Learning outcomes for study section 12. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the rejection of metaphysics, explain Hume's stand against metaphysics, explain Carnap's rejection of metaphysics. Rejection of metaphysics. At a point in its historical development, metaphysics as a discipline started to receive very harsh and devastating criticisms, most especially from the empiricist philosophers, starting with David Hume through Immanuel Kant and other neo-Kantians down to Ludwig Wittgenstein, Maurice Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, and Alfred J. Ayer. The main reason which led to the rejection of metaphysics is the rise of modern science and the realization that its success has been due to the refusal to accept any view about the world which is not supported by evidence. These criticisms culminated in what was later captioned as the rejection of metaphysics. In fact, Kant's own acknowledgement that he was awakened from the dogmatic slumber of rational metaphysics by Hume's empirical theory marks the turning point where he broke off decisively from metaphysics. Hume had earlier maintained that metaphysics is impossible because the human mind finds itself lost in a maze of contradictions when it goes beyond the realm of possible experience. From Kant down to the era of logical positivism, various philosophers of empirical bent expressed their disdain for metaphysics. But the logical positivists further reinforced empiricism in their drive against metaphysics by maintaining that for a proposition to be verifiable, it must pass through the purgatory of sense, perception, but that metaphysics derives from the recognition of some unique reality that does not conform to empirical cognition but can only be apprehended by metaphysical speculative faculties of the mind. Logical positivism was founded by Maurice Schlick, but after the death of Schlick, the leadership of the school fell on Rudolf Carnap. The aim of logical positivism was to free philosophy from metaphysics. For many of the positivists, metaphysics is not only an impossible and difficult enterprise to engage in, the term metaphysical carries with it the imputation of emptiness or sophistry. As Maurice Lazarowitz succinctly put it, whatever its metaphysics is, its nature still remains unknown to us. Following from this, Karl Pearson concludes that metaphysics is built either on air or on quicksand. Let us examine more closely, first, Hume's criticism of metaphysics, and then the argument of Rudolf Carnap in his article titled The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language, 1959. What was the reaction of the positivists to metaphysics? The positivists believed metaphysics is not only an impossible but also difficult enterprise to engage in. Hume against metaphysics. With the groundwork laid in the theory of knowledge, Hume goes on to apply the empirical criterion of meaning to the areas of philosophy that had been the center of so much controversy and confusion. He takes as his first target the venerable idea of substance, which is considered as the point that marks his first rather break from the traditions of the past, including that of his own British empiricism. Although Locke and Berkeley were card-carrying empiricists and sought to subject all knowledge claims to the bar of experience, they agreed with Descartes that the idea of substance was indispensable. For instance, Locke believed the external world was populated with material substances. He thought it incomprehensible that there was no entity or substance in which the apple's quantities inheres. However, Hume challenges us to find the idea of substance in our fleeting experiences of color, sounds, and taste. Ontological metaphysics in the development of British empiricism comes to a dead end in these arguments of Hume as far as they are accepted, of course. He cuts the last slender thread between the perceptions of the mind and any kind of independent external cause. This does not mean that anyone ceases to believe in external causes of perceptions or independent physical objects. Rather, for him, the imagination of fancy is so strong that he takes it for granted that whatever may be the reader's opinion at this present moment, hence he will be persuaded there is both an external and internal world. It is the imagination of fancy and not reason or the senses that leads us to believe in this double world. Ontological metaphysics is concerned with establishing a rational theory of the link between these two supposed worlds, but Hume's arguments, if correct, establish that only imagination can possibly operate in this area. To the extent that metaphysics is based on reason, there is the hope that it can achieve some degree of certainty and lay claim to being a rational discipline. But if metaphysics is dissociated from reason and must depend upon imagination, it is open to the charge of being in the same class with wish fulfillment, dreams, or idle conjecture, for which general agreement among men is unlikely. Reason cannot trust imagination, and if the only way to knowledge of an independent external world is through imagination, then philosophers, as men of reason, ought to give up looking for such knowledge. Thus, no matter how strongly our imaginations assure us that there is an independent external world which is the source of our perceptions, profound and intense reflection lead us to a skeptical doubt that we must respect. Were Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley card-carrying empiricists? No, Descartes was not a card-carrying empiricist. Rudolf Carnap's rejection of metaphysics. Rudolf Carnap's aim, like that of every positivist, was to purge philosophy of metaphysical and psychological questions and thus reduce the proper task of philosophy to that of logical analysis. To start with, he identified three kinds of related problems and doctrines in traditional philosophy, metaphysics, psychology, and logic. His intention was to use the method of logical analysis, which is the main business of philosophy, to purge philosophy of metaphysical and psychological claims which are not amenable to the verification theory. Thus, his main business was a rejection of metaphysics using the verification theory, and in this way also reject logical atomism, which was said to be a form of metaphysics. To do this, he first explained what he meant by the method of verification. The verification theory consisted of the notion that the meaning of a statement is the method of its verification. The assumption behind this principle was that verification must always rest on empirical observation. Any proposition that does not pass this test will be said to have no meaning. It distinguished between direct and indirect verification. These two forms of verification are central to scientific method, for in the field of science, every proposition either asserts something about present perception or about future perceptions. In both cases, verification is either through direct perception or by logical connection of already verified propositions. As he puts in, a statement P, which is not directly verified, can only be verified by direct verification of statements deduced from P together with other already verified statements. He, however, pointed out the deficiency of the indirect method and added that universal statements cannot be so verified because the number of deducible instances by the help of other statements already verified or directly verified is infinite. Rudolf then applied the verification theory to statements of metaphysics. Metaphysicians, he argued, cannot avoid making their statements non-verifiable because if they made them verifiable, the decision about the truth or falsehood of their doctrine will depend upon experience and therefore belong to the region of science, and this will contradict their earlier claims to teaching knowledge which is of a higher level than that of empirical science. Thus, they are compelled to cut all connection between their statements and experience, and precisely by this procedure, they deprive them such statements of any sense. The same problem, he says, applies to all philosophical doctrines which assert or deny the reality or unreality of something. According to Carnap, nominative ethics and value judgment belong to the realm of metaphysics. He agreed that though there can be a science of ethics in the form of psychological or sociological or other empirical investigation about the actions of human beings and their effects on other people, he insisted that the philosophy of moral values or norms does not rest on any empirical fact. It's rather a pretended investigation of what is good or evil, what it is right to do or what it is wrong to do. Such statements do not assert anything and can neither be proved nor disproved. According to Carnap, the statement of nominative ethics, whether they have the form of rules or the form of value statements, have no theoretical sense, are not scientific. Most philosophers have been deceived into thinking that a value statement is really an assertive statement and must be true or false. But actually, a value statement is nothing but a command in a misleading grammatical form. To further demolish metaphysics from the confines of a genuine philosophical business, Carnap distinguished between the expressive and representative or cognitive functions of language. For example, the statement, "Now I am merry," is a linguistic utterance which asserts the merry mood and can be either true or false, but a word like laughter merely expresses feelings but do not assert it, and such word performs only an expressive function and not a representative function. Carnap asserted that metaphysical statements have only an expressive function and are therefore neither true nor false because they assert nothing. Metaphysical statements cannot therefore pass the test of the verification theory. Having thrashed out metaphysical problems and doctrines, Carnap then proceeded to eliminate psychological questions from philosophy. His main task here was to debunk the belief that psychology is inseparably part of philosophy. To him, the propositions of psychology belong to the region of empirical science in just the same way the propositions of biology and chemistry. When you look at the historical development of the sciences, however, you see a link between philosophy and other sciences, but this umbilical cord between philosophy and the other sciences, including psychology, has been cut, and many philosophers have yet to realize this. This leads many into dealing with psychological questions which concern all kinds of so-called mental events, feelings, thoughts, images, and so on, as if they were logical ones. The questions of psychology, he argues, can be answered only by experience, not by philosophizing. Having eliminated metaphysical and psychological questions, the only proper task of philosophy now is logical analysis. What then is logical analysis? Carnap explained that the method is used in eliminating metaphysical and psychological questions from philosophy is itself logical analysis. He then set out to explain the character of the statements which are the result of logical analysis. To this, he agreed with him that only the statements of mathematics and empirical science have sense and that all other statements are without sense and should therefore be committed to the flame. A critic of Carnap's argument: when Carnap applied the verification principle to metaphysics and classical ethics, the principle demolishes them and renders them meaningless. He was, however, not unaware that the assertion made by the principle itself cannot be empirically verified, and so, by its own criterion, the principle is nonsensical. He attempted to tackle this major defect by appealing to the defense of Wittgenstein to such a problem in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, but rejected Wittgenstein's view on the grounds of inconsistency, thereby making this criticism a major threat to the verification theory. Rudolf Carnap's blanket rejection of metaphysics and morals was later turned down and or reversed by other positivists. A.J. Heyer described this temper by saying that the metaphysician is treated no longer as a criminal but as a patient. There may be good reasons why he says the strange things he does. Ethics in Heyer's view is no longer nonsense but a discipline whose language is analyzed both for its relation to fact and for its value in pointing to a problem. Ludwig Wittgenstein also did not reject the statement of metaphysics outright. To him, metaphysical language may indeed create confusion, but the central concern of philosophy is to deal with problems that baffle and confuse us because of the lack of clarity. Philosophy, he argues, does not provide men with new or more information, but adds clarity by a careful description of language. This new position by Wittgenstein informed the formation of the conceptual elucidation school, to which some of the positivists later belong. Another major defect of Carnap's position is the serious question of what constitutes verification. The assumption behind the verification principle was that whatever could be said meaningfully would be ultimately reducible to observational statements. However, scientific statements are mostly the basis of scientific prediction, and one would wonder how such statements that make a prediction can be verified by observation. There is no single fact that can verify the future truth of a general scientific statement, and as such, a statement when tested with the verification principle will be meaningless. To save the verification principle from this attack, a distinction was drawn between weak and strong forms of the verification principle. The weak form simply says that a statement must be at least capable of verification or verifiable in principle. This still has not been able to save the verification theory, thereby turning down an initial intensity of positivism against metaphysics. Carnap's rejection of metaphysics, if accepted, will reduce the traditional functions of philosophy and thus reduce the relevance of philosophy to contemporary issues of life and existence. The reality of metaphysical entities cannot be completely denied, and science is not equipped enough to tackle metaphysical problems which are not deducible from experience. Again, a rejection of moral norms and value judgments as nonsense is also unfair. Norms and value judgments are the building block on which orderliness and peaceful coexistence is based in any society. Every society has a set of moral values, relative or non-relative. A rejection of such norms as nonsense is a suggestion that the society be organized without set rules and values, and such a society will be more or less run like a state of nature with all its attendant inconveniences. Who formed the formation of the conceptual elucidation school? Wittgenstein informed the school. Summary of Study Section 12. In Study Section 12, you have learned that 1. It was the position of Hume that reality is given to us through the sense as impressions and ideas, and whatever is not given in the light of this media, that is, impressions and ideas, cannot be judged to be real. For Hume, they are meaningless nonsense. 2. Subject matters like causality, induction, moral judgment, and the notion of God stand condemned as unreal and illusory according to Hume's empiricism. Of course, there is a very close affinity between the epistemic status and ontological status of any being or reality in Hume's considerations. 3. There is a straddles between epistemology and metaphysics. To be sure, the Humean project represents a patron oracle to the doctrines expounded in the works of logical positivists such as Rudolf Carnap, Maurice Schlick, and A.J. Ayer. 4. In Ayer's rejection of metaphysics, he attempted a systematic analysis and arguments why metaphysics and metaphysical concepts are not able to meet the criterion of meaningfulness. And this formed the foundation of the positivist philosophy that emphasized the analytic-synthetic distinction. Meaningful ideas must be related to matters of fact and the relations of ideas or analytic and synthetic statements. Beyond this, for Hume and the positivists, every other conceptualization could only be meaningless nonsense. This is the end of Field 301. Thanks for listening.